Rader, I need to find out more information. On that particular day, the 15th day of January, 1974, can you tell me where you went to kill Mr. Joseph Otero?
I think it's 1834, Edgemore.
All right. Can you tell me approximately what time of day you went there?
Somewhere between 7 and 7:30.
This particular location, did you know these people?
No, that was part of my, what you call fantasy. These people were selected.
All right. So you
Yeah.
were engaged in some kind of fantasy during this period of time?
Yes, sir.
All right. When you use the term fantasy, is this something you were doing for your personal pleasure?
Sexual fantasy, sir.
I see.
In February 2005, a police detective sat down at his desk, opened an email, and quietly changed the course of a 31-year-old murder investigation, not with a fingerprint, not with DNA, but with 3 kilobytes of deleted metadata sitting inside a purple floppy disk. The man who sent it had spent 3 decades taunting police, naming himself, comparing himself to other infamous killers in his letters, and daring anyone to catch him. He believed he was untouchable. He was right, for 31 years. And then he wasn't. And the thing that finally caught him wasn't a mistake he made in 2005. It was a habit he had never once been able to break. This is the story of the man who called himself BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill. A name he chose for himself because he wanted people to understand exactly what he did before they ever knew who he was. And this is the story of how, after 3 decades of silence, taunts, false leads, and near misses that came agonizingly close, he ended up being the one who handed police the final piece. It starts in a quiet, working-class neighborhood in Wichita, Kansas, in January of 1974. This was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked at night, where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, where neighbors knew each other by name, and violent crime was something that happened in bigger cities, on the news, to other people. That sense of safety ended the day a family was murdered inside their own home, in broad daylight, by someone who spent hours there and left almost nothing behind. No forced entry that made obvious sense. No clear motive investigators could immediately identify. No obvious connection between killer and victims. Just a crime scene that suggested careful planning, unsettling patience, and total control. And then a killer who simply walked back out into the ordinary rhythm of the city and disappeared. For months, investigators had almost nothing to go on. No name, no face, no real trail to follow, just a case that was quickly going cold in a city that had never dealt with anything like it. Then a letter arrived at a local newspaper, and everything changed. The killer wanted credit for what he had done. He was, in a very real sense, frustrated that his crime hadn't gotten more attention. He described details of the crime that only the person responsible could have known, details investigators had deliberately kept out of the press, specifically to filter out the false confessions that flood in during any high-profile case. And in that letter, he gave himself a name built from the method he was proud of. From that point forward, Wichita wasn't only hunting a murderer, it was corresponding with one, on his schedule, on his terms. That's what made this case different from almost any other unsolved murder investigation in American history. BTK didn't just kill and disappear into silence like most offenders do. He wrote letters. He mailed poems. He sent coded puzzles and word searches to newsrooms, daring amateur and professional cryptographers alike to crack them. He left packages in public places specifically so police would find them, tucked into library books, left in parks, dropped in mailboxes, always calculated, always timed, always just enough to prove it was really him without giving away who he actually was. He wanted an audience. He wanted recognition. He wanted, in his own words across multiple letters, to be remembered alongside the most notorious killers in American history. And for years, the city gave him exactly what he wanted, living in a state of low-grade terror every time a new letter surfaced, wondering if this would be the one that finally revealed a name. Profilers and investigators built psychological pictures of him based on what he sent, a need for control, a fixation on being seen as intelligent, a strange formality in his writing that didn't match the horror of what he'd done. Task force members would later describe the strange experience of essentially getting to know an offender's mind in detail, his vocabulary, his obsessions, his pride, while having absolutely no idea what he looked like or what name he answered to. It's one of the strangest dynamics in the history of American criminal investigation. A killer who wanted to be known, matched against a police force that desperately wanted to know him, and neither side getting what they wanted for 31 years. There were near misses along the way, moments that, with hindsight, feel almost unbearable. Composite sketches were released to the public based on limited witness accounts and circulated for years, close enough in places to unsettle people who knew him, but never quite specific enough to produce the one tip that would crack the case. Tip lines received thousands of calls over the decades. Investigators pursued leads that stretched across state lines. And through all of it, the answer was, by several accounts, living an ordinary life well within the same city limits the entire time. Before we get into how this case finally broke open after 3 decades, if you're the kind of person who likes taking a case apart, piece by piece, instead of just hearing the headline version, hit subscribe now, because that's exactly what this channel does every single week. And honestly, the way this one ends is one of the most satisfying twists in true crime history. You will not want to miss it. And then, nothing. For nearly 2 decades, the letters stopped completely, as abruptly as they'd started. The original detectives on the case grew older. Some retired without ever getting close to an answer, carrying the weight of an unsolved case with them for the rest of their careers. Task forces were quietly scaled back as budgets and priorities shifted elsewhere. The case became something closer to local folklore than an active investigation. A story parents told their kids to make sure the doors stayed locked at night, filed away in evidence boxes, gathering dust in a records room that almost nobody visited anymore. Meanwhile, the man responsible for all of it was living an entirely unremarkable life just a few miles from where it all began. A neighbor, a churchgoer, a man deeply involved in his local community, in ways that made him, to absolutely everyone around him, the last person anyone would ever suspect of anything. Then, in 2004, on the 30th anniversary of the original murders, a local news outlet ran a retrospective piece on the still unsolved case, revisiting the fear, the letters, the decades of silence, and the fact that whoever did this had simply never been caught. And BTK, after 17 years without a single word, couldn't resist responding. He started communicating again, reaching out with a new round of letters and packages, seemingly unable to stay quiet once he saw his own crimes back in the headlines after so long. It's worth pausing on that, because it tells you almost everything about what actually drove him. He wasn't hiding out of fear. He had gone quiet by choice, and the moment his name, or rather, the name he'd given himself, resurfaced in public, he couldn't resist stepping back into the spotlight. What he didn't fully understand was how much the world had changed since he'd last done this. Investigators now had access to forensic and digital tools that simply didn't exist in the 1970s, or even the 1980s and early 90s. But he didn't know that. He still believed he was exactly as untouchable as he'd always been. At one point, almost conversationally, in a public statement specifically designed to draw him out further, police let it be known that a floppy disk could theoretically be traced back to whoever sent it. It was, in effect, bait. BTK, cautious as always, apparently asked around to check whether that was actually true. He was told no, that it couldn't be done, that floppy disks couldn't be traced that way. He believed it completely. So, confident in his own untraceability, after 30 years of getting away with it, he sent one anyway. That single disk was the beginning of the end for him. When investigators examined it, they found deleted metadata buried inside the file structure. Information he never knew was there. Information he had no idea he was leaving behind every single time he used that computer. That metadata pointed to a specific computer used at a specific local church. And from that one thread, investigators were able to trace it to a name tied to that congregation: Dennis Rader, a Boy Scout leader, a church council president, a city compliance officer, someone whose literal day job involved enforcing the rules and codes of his own community. A man who, by every outward measure available to the people around him, was simply an ordinary, even admirable part of the community. Sit with that for a second, because it's the part of this story that tends to stick with people the longest. The man who had spent 31 years being impossible to find, who had built an entire secret identity around being untraceable, and openly enjoyed taunting the people trying to catch him, had, this entire time, been utterly ordinary in his day-to-day life. A neighbor, a Cub Scout leader, a guy who mowed his lawn on Saturdays and sat through committee meetings at church on Sundays. For a lot of people who follow this case closely, that gap between the calculated, attention-hungry figure in the letters and the unremarkable man living quietly down the street is the single most disturbing part of the entire story. It wasn't a monster hiding in plain sight in some obvious, cinematic way. It was a man who fit in so completely, for so long, that decades of investigators, neighbors, fellow churchgoers, and even people who worked alongside him never once looked twice. In February 2005, he was arrested. The city that had lived under this particular shadow for 3 decades finally had an answer to a question it had been asking since before some of its own residents were even born. In the interviews and court proceedings that followed, a picture emerged of a man who had compartmentalized his life with almost clinical precision. One version for his family and community, an entirely separate version that existed only in secret and in the letters he sent. He would go on to plead guilty to the murders and was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms. Kansas did not have an active death penalty covering the specific years these crimes were committed, so life imprisonment was the maximum sentence available under the law at that time. What this case leaves behind isn't just the grim details of what happened decades ago. It's a genuinely unsettling case study in how wide the gap can be between a person's public identity and their private one, and a reminder of how technology eventually outran a man who had built his entire sense of power around being untraceable. He was arrogant enough to believe that what worked in 1974 would still work in 2005, more than 3 decades later. It didn't. Investigations like this one are the reason cold case units still exist, still revisit old evidence with new tools, still believe that time isn't necessarily working against them. Cold cases are never really cold. They're just waiting for the technology, and sometimes the patience, to catch up. He spent 3 decades being clever enough to vanish, taunting the very people trying to find him, convinced he had outsmarted an entire city and an entire justice system. In the end, all it took was one habit he could never quite break: the need to be heard, to be recognized, to make absolutely sure everyone knew exactly who was responsible for what he'd done. That need is what gave him away, in the end, more thoroughly than any piece of physical evidence ever could have. If a case like this pulled you in, the decades-long hunt, the letters, the twist that a man this careful was undone by something this small, that's exactly the kind of story we dig into every single week here. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive, and drop a comment letting us know which case you want covered next. We read every single one.